Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first of our honors program colloquium events for the spring 2022 here at A&M Texarkana. My name is Craig McAshen, and I am the director of the Academic Honors Program. And it is my very, very great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Sara Lawrence, who is Associate Professor of Educational Psychology and Associate Dean of the College of Arts, Sciences, and Education. Is that right? We change our names sometimes. And today she's going to be speaking to us on improvement science as a methodology. So, Dr. Lawrence, take it away.
Yeah, so it is a privilege to be here, and I'm excited to be the first this semester. So, yay. I wanted to do this because a lot has been happening over the last year and a half, and improvement science is a blossoming methodological framework that is being used in more and more in research and practice and education. And so as we have the EDD doctoral program, thought that my colleagues and the university community should know more about it and how we're thinking about it in education. So, you see my second slide? There we go. Do you see a second slide? Aims for this presentation. So first I want to introduce you at a high level to improvement science in general, and particularly in research, in educational research and improvement practices. And then I want to explain how we in education got to this point where improvement science is needed in our arsenal of tools and methods for research and practice, and provide examples of how we're using improvement science in teacher preparation right now. We have several grants, and both of those are using improvement science as we move forward. So, and engage in these transformation efforts that we're doing for continuous improvement. And then lastly, I want to explain how we're using improvement science to move forward as a research method in our doctoral program, and what would that look like. So always want to start with the definition. As it is a blossoming area, there are lots of definitions out there. And so in a moment, I'll show you kind of where I'm getting my information on so that you have context. But I like this definition, and it's, that it kind of gives the steps in there. So it's undergirded by foundational principles that guide scholar practitioners to define problems, understand the system that produces the problems, identify changes to rectify the problems, and test the efficacy of those changes and spread the changes, if change is indeed an improvement. Because there's always that. Change is not always good. So here's where I'm coming from. So the main books that I'm using are Education Leader's Guide to Improvement Science and Improvement Science in Education, a primer. But I'm also using a lot, you'll see that I have snippets of videos that we participated in as a program with West Ed. We've done a lot of training with them. They are a research development and service program. They provide a lot of technical service. So we've been working with them a lot as part of our Raise Your Hand Texas grant. And I've got some slides from them as well. And then I'm also looking at the Carnegie Project for Education Doctorate. So we went through the process last year and were accepted as a member, which is kind of a big deal. There's, we're with over 100 EDD programs across the world, actually, and working on what it means to be a scholar practitioner in education and education leadership. And then lastly, I do want to provide an example. And so I've got a dissertation that was done, and it was CPED's Dissertation of the Year last year. So I want to show you kind of what that looks like. So I want to start with just a little bit of history, and I'm not going to go in great detail, so don't be scared. But I want to start with a little history of, where we've come in research and science and education. And so, like all the sciences, it was initiated with the 4-step process of observe, hypothesize, experiment, and conclude, which Galileo and Bacon used to really solidify Western science, and Bacon in particular, inductive reasoning processes, and which led to the whole discussion that can still be discussed at times, between rationalism and empiricism. But it wasn't until the early 1900s where studies were really started being used for education. And they were based on the studies of the time, which were the time and motion studies, to determine a single best method of something. So if you're not familiar with that is, I have a short video about what that is. It's not Taylor, but you might recognize, because there's been movies about this one, might recognize some of this, but it gives the idea of time and motion studies. It's coming.
In the first decades of the century, America was speeding up. Photography not only documented America's growing industrial might, it was put to work as a tool of the modern assembly line. In this speeded-up world, factory owners looked to the camera to make their workers move even faster.
Frank Bunker Gilbreth took his first step into the field of management in 1885 when, on his second day as an apprentice bricklayer, he questioned why he was being taught several different methods for laying bricks. His interest in finding the best method led to his development of motion and fatigue study.
Early in the century, Frank Gilbreth used photographs to break a worker's every action into the smallest units, revealing every unnecessary movement. He studied the fastest workers in order to teach maximum efficiency to everyone. In Gilbreth's cyclograph technique, he attached flashing lights to a worker's fingers to indicate the length of time a motion would take. Soon Gilbreth's photographs were changing the lives of everyone from golfers to oyster shuckers. Gilbreth observed that surgeons took more time looking for their instruments than they did in performing the operation itself. He suggested a new procedure. Keeping an eye on the incision, the surgeon would extend an open palm to the nurse and utter the now famous words, "Scalpel, please." Some accused Gilbreth of turning skilled workers into robots, but the bosses loved his techniques. Gilbreth even brought his zeal for efficiency to his own large family. His children got their revenge when they wrote about home life with their eccentric father and called it cheaper by the dozen. Gilbreth died of a heart attack at age 55.
Okay, so that gives you a sense of what time and motion studies are about. And so they were meant, during the industrial era of determining the single best method. And it was Taylor who really said, and it's known as Taylorism, that this was a way to make education more efficient. And, that's when you had a lot, which you can imagine, students in rows, things like that. And it wasn't really until 1983 and Nation at Risk, and you can even cite some things before that started to hark on the notion of, there's things going on here that we really need to pay more attention to, and we need a better way. And then in 2002 with No Child Left Behind and the accountability movement, that really ramped up. And there was just the discussion that education was really left behind in the research, in scientific research. And so they said that during that time, they said that research that we need to use in education needs to be scientifically based research. It needs to be experimental research. And they even had a place where we could go, the What Works Clearinghouse, where we could go to find research on this. But there's, as you might imagine, there's some issues with this. Next page. Okay, so I want you, I'm going to play another short video. We're not going to watch the 14 minutes, but we'll watch a minute or two of it. But I want you to pretend that if you aren't already a researcher, that you are a researcher. And then what kind of variables do you need to consider in this environment?
If you want to achieve better results,
Time to take a drink of something. It's loading.
We're going to learn today about the main idea of a story and how to find the supporting details. But you know how I am. I don't want you just to find the supporting details. I want you to be able to tell me why they're the supporting details. Because a true learner can not only state the facts, but they can defend it just like an attorney could defend you too. So here we go. Turning your reading spiral to main idea. I think we did a main idea table. Main idea. Find that main idea table, or you may have drawn a main idea chair. I left that option up to you. A main idea table or a main idea chair. Take a few minutes to look over your notes and refresh your mind about what main idea is. Give me a thumbs up if you think you know what a main idea is. Thumbs up if you think you know. If you're not too sure, give me one in the middle. Okay, hands down. Some of my thumbs up people, what is a main idea? What's a main idea? Adrian. It's the big picture. It's the big thing the story is about. Okay. You also saw supporting detail on your spiral. What's a supporting detail? A supporting detail. Supporting detail.
Okay. So anybody have any thoughts on what kind of variables that you would need to consider in this?
Maybe her wait time, like how much time she's giving the student, or response time.
Sure. Anything else?
The prompts that the instructor was providing?
Yeah, so really everything that the instructor brings to the table needs to be considered. What else needs to be considered? Everything that the students bring to the classroom needs to be considered. The environment itself needs to be considered. In this video, there were people, there were visitors. So there's a ton of variables in here. So looking at what makes good research, you look at internal validity. So no variable except the treatment variable. We don't know what the treatment variable would be in here. It might be wait time, can influence the outcome. Can you say that as internal validity as such an example, high or low? It'd be pretty low. There's a ton of variables in here that could influence the outcome. So to do this more reliably, you would have to, for validity purposes, you would have to do this in something where it's more controlled. And so, when we talk about experimental studies, we always talk about the laboratory where you can control everything. But the problem with that is external validity. The higher the internal validity, often the lower the generalizability to other settings. And so if you did something like this, with one student and one teacher in a laboratory setting, it wouldn't be too generalizable to another setting. So these issues are huge. And research in general is complicated and complex. And because of the settings that we want to know answers, we want answers for, educational research is complex. I wanted to share, I had the opportunity years ago, I think it was like 2003, to visit Project Zero at Harvard, which is their research institute, and actually hear Howard Gardner speak. And he gave this example that I thought was really good, because I think it also talks about other variables. So take a moment and think about, it's a Sunday morning and you want to read a good book, or you want to read the newspaper, whatever, and you have your very favorite beverage with you, coffee, a cocoa. Think about where you would sit, your favorite chair in your house, all these things. So take a moment and get that clear in your head. So you're enjoying the morning, you're comfortable, you have something to drink, you're reading, you're enjoying it, you're learning new things, but then you have a toothache. All of a sudden you're not learning so much. And then you have a headache because you have a toothache. Then you realize you didn't sleep very well last night, and you didn't have breakfast, and this is your fourth cup of coffee, so you're feeling nauseated. So it can go on. So I think that always struck me as a good example of the things that can interfere with learning, that are internal, that we don't see, that have to be considered. It's complex. Okay, so it's complicated. So how do we address educational research, and a research for that matter? And so, you always, with traditional research and any kind of research, you really try to start with the philosophical and theoretical underpinnings. And John Creswell, who's an applied research methodologist, and a main researcher for education, he talks about philosophically, researchers make claims about what is knowledge, ontology, how we know it, epistemology, what values go into it, axology, how we write about it, rhetoric, and the process for studying, methodology. And then Deming, who is an engineer and statistician, who will become increasingly important in this, as we talk today. A statement, if it conveys knowledge, predicts future outcome with risk of being wrong, and that it fits with without failure observations of the past. Rational prediction requires theory and builds on knowledge through systematic revision and extension of theory based on comparison of prediction with observation. These underpinnings matter, and they help to identify the research paradigm for a study. So looking at different paradigms, positivism, post-positive, constructivism, pragmatism, the type of questions and what your questions are asking can lead to different ways of thinking about it, and the type of research. So the method of research, is it positivism and post-positivism leads to quantitative research, constructivism, because truth exists. There is a truth. Post-positivism questions that, but there is a truth. And then constructivism, which is more inductive, says that the truth is in the eye of the beholder. And so that's where you get into more qualitative and looking at people's lived experiences. They become the experts in it. And then pragmatism uses both and mixed methods. But it's asking, is it useful? And says that it should be useful, whatever you're doing. So these lead to approaches of research. And all of these are used by improvement science. And so theory-based is the more traditional that when we think of PhDs and what they do and adding to the literature and then there's problem-based, which addresses problems in the field. Action research and programmatic evaluations look at this. And then there's also critical, liberatory, participatory advocacy. So research, which is really interested in with social change and impact. So, and this and practice, because, like critical theory, which looks at groups and power structures, constructs of privilege and marginalization between different groups, led to the practice of Freire's critical pedagogy, where you early on, and this was in 1968, where you try to remove inequities based on these things. And this is where we're really at in the research right now in education. So again, traditional research looks at a primary audience that is different from accountability research and then continuous improvement. The audiences are different, the purposes are different, and the type of measurement that you use. And again, improvement science makes use of all of these. So why improvement science in education? And this is something that I got out of Hennett Crawford's book that I thought kind of put it in a little capsule for you all. So there's always a sense of urgency. The stakes are high in education, is the feeling that's always there. And so a lot of times districts will implement new things without giving them a chance, or hold on them too long, or they'll implement something and then they'll add something else. So it creates a lot of chaos. And so improvement science works to alleviate that. And so as it states, its deep dive into understanding the system, its stakeholder involvement in the design and implementation of changes, and its rapid tests of an intervention's effectiveness guide practitioner to only adopt or abandon when it makes sense for the organization's predefined goals. So I mentioned Deming was going to become important here, and he indeed is considered the father of improvement science. And so he talks about the system of profound knowledge. And so he talks about these 4 areas. So appreciation for a system, knowledge about variation, theory of knowledge, and psychology. So I'm going to read just a little bit about what it says about each of these. So Deming defines a system as a network of interdependent components that cooperate to accomplish some aim. He elaborates, without aim, there is no system. You may be thinking about the university system in your state or your school district as a complex system, but if you look on a more molecular scale, your institution, the departments within your institution, down to individual classrooms, all are systems as well. Indeed, he talks about your family being a system. Then the knowledge about variation. In explaining knowledge of variation, he gives an example of a little girl and her teacher's note to her parents after 2 tests. On both tests, she scored below average. He goes on to talk about the impact of being told you are below average. And what would happen to self-perception if there were no counter narrative to that message. But what Deming further points out is the teacher failed to observe that roughly half her pupils will be above average on any test and the other half will be below. There is not much anyone can do about it. This is why we need to understand variation. There's no cause for alarm if half the class is below average by definition. That is to be expected. Being half above and half below average is predictable or stable, notwithstanding that facet of variation can lead to unnecessary panic and intervention. This is only why measurement is important. The average on some measurement tells us very little. If there is a demarcation for proficiency and the entire class is above proficient, that is excellent, but even such a case, half would be above average, half would be below average. Understanding variation helps you identify cause for concern. Then he talks about the theory of knowledge. The third component, Deming's ontology is based in prediction. A statement, if it conveys knowledge, predicts future outcome with the risk of being wrong, and that it fits without failure observations of the past. He extends his ontological definition with his epistemological orientation. Rational prediction requires theory and builds knowledge through systematic revision and extension of theory based on comparison of prediction with observation. In essence, the theory of knowledge is the theory about how one gains knowledge, and according to Deming, is through testing and revision of theory. Lastly, the fourth and final element of profound knowledge is psychology. Deming saw how psychology is a means to help managers understand people. He defined management as about prediction. And he provides 14 points. He understood that in order to bring about change in an organization, you had to do some work to understand what motivates people within the organization. He is very critical of ranking individuals, asserting that it only harms motivation. Since Deming's work, many others have done work on dealing with human aspect of introducing change, because improvement science is about improving, which is about change. So what does improvement science look like in practice? So essentially, this is a model for it. So you establish an aim, what you're trying to accomplish. You measure, how will we know if change is an improvement? And then change, what changes can we make that will result in improvement? But you don't do this once, so then you plan, you do it, you study it, and then you act, you make some decisions about doing it. So you're thinking and doing, and you don't do it once, it is a cycle over and over, and you continuously learn from your data. So this is what we've been doing as part of, long story short, we have a grant with Raise Your Hand Texas, and so we have a improvement plan that includes our aims and such. And we are in the process of doing this cycle, and we're probably somewhere down there between development and refinement. And I can even show you a visual of what our plan looks like. So here it is. So I I'm very visual, so I have to have a visual. So it's written out, but this is a visual to kind of provide what it's about. And it includes, because we have a lot of support systems for this. So the 10 itself is our plan, our continuous improvement plan. We establish root causes for what our plan is about, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But so the putti above on the very top of the tent are our 3 root causes for what we need to improve, which happen to be from a system of things that we did, which I'll talk about when I talk about root causes. But basically, it has a lot to do with our working in silos and not communicating internally well, and not having the same language for our students to make their journey through our program make as much sense as it should. So the 3 putti are clarity, community, and common understanding. So the 2 things that we are working on, our aims, have to do with quality of course content, and then also quality of clinical practice are our 2 works of art. Our audiences, I actually at one point I had it where the audiences were sitting on bleachers on the side because it's all our stakeholders, but a better representation of that is that they are actually our dance partners. And so they're dancing around our works of art. Our theory of action is the yellow oval, but it's the ground, it's the rug under our works of art. And so our theory is that candidates who are day one ready, equity minded, and socially just will disrupt the cycle of poverty in Northeast Texas and Southwest Arkansas. So that's our theory that is leading under everything that we do. We have lots of supports to help us through this process. And WestEd is one that I mentioned, helping us through the improvement science process in particular. US Prep is our partner by our side, doing this particularly for our clinical processes and guiding us through this as well. Teaching Works is through the University of Michigan. They have a wonderful program that provides a framework for teacher educators that we're utilizing for practice-based instruction and performance assessments. And then we have the other things that we're using that a lot of you guys, ACU has helped support our efforts. And we also have a partnership with Sanford Harmony, which has among other things. So that's the plan. So you don't still start with saying what you want to do, just like any good research, you have to start by identifying and naming the problem. And so likewise, in this situation, we had to do the same thing. And so, as I said, we came down to 3 root causes. One of the things before we started is that we participated in a audit by TPI US, which they actually audit education programs. And we got a lot of information from them and where we need to go. And then we took it further where we did more things. And improvement science, they have a lot of tools to help you do this. This is just one tool that to help get to root cause analysis. So this is the fishbone diagram, which you are trying to get to the head of the fish on what the problem is. And so you identify major factors. It took lots of sticky notes and discussion. And then you have detail factors, and then you get to the root cause. That was just one thing we did. We also have faculty participate in empathy interviews early on, and then focus groups where these discussions were had. And then actually that was focus groups turned into Revive meetings that we have weekly for our transformation efforts. So once you identify your root causes, then you make your aim statements. And so this is from a West Ed one that they provided as a review this fall. I picked this slide because I was very proud that these examples are actually ours from last year. So the aim statements, are basically SMART goals that you use. And last year we had 3 aim statements. This year we reduced it to 2 because of the work and the content involved. So you identify your aim statements. So after your aim statements, then it's measure and change. So what are we trying to accomplish? And then measure, how do we know if change is an improvement? So measures. So those outcome measures you use, and these can be from research and accountability. So like we have to monitor our test scores for accreditation. And so these make decent outcome measures. The only issue with those, they're lagging indicators. And so there's not a whole lot you can do about them once you get them. And so process measures with improvement science are incredibly important. And so these are leading indicators. And so you do these more frequently, and they're part of the system. Okay, and so process measures, these are meant to be simple and meant to use things that you have. So, and so again, simple, frequent, and so on. So you identify your measures, and then you also need to identify change. So what changes can we make that will result in improvement? And this translates into the actions that you do. So change. So what is a change idea? Specific work practices or interventions that represent an alteration to how work is done. I actually love this slide because I use the fishbowl idea and when I'm discussing research and quantitative and qualitative, where you talk about the researcher in a quantitative study is outside the fishbowl, looking into the fishbowl. There's a distance between them. And then when you talk about qualitative research, you talk about being in the fishbowl, with them, because you're constructing knowledge there. And then you can even take that further to talk about positionality, where you're talking about, are you a goldfish with all the goldfish, or are you a koi fish with the goldfish, depending on what their role as the researcher is in relation to the participants. But this one is talking about, no, there's a whole nother fishbowl. So I enjoy that. So where did change ideas come from? They come from the places you would expect. So research knowledge. What does the literature have to say about solving this problem? What is some practical knowledge? What are some new and different solutions that could be measured? And then what does our analysis of the problem say that might have a solution emerge, a potential solution emerge? Here's some examples of change ideas and some associated actions to see how it can turn into those things that you do. And then you gather your data and you analyze it, and then you figure out how to use it. And this is a big process, as Unji, Dr. Cho, and Dr. Cooper can tell us. There are data leads, and so we're working on this. How are we going to gather it? How are we going to gather it better? Because of all the variability. And how do we analyze it, and how do we use it then? And the using is a big part of it because of all the stakeholders involved. So how you present your data is really critical. And there's, lots of advisement we've been getting from WestEd on how to use that. How to use different displays for what reason. And here's an example of one that Dr. Cooper put together for data from our fall. We have in our clinical practice, students go through what are called POP cycles, which are pre-observation, observation, and post-observation cycle. So they do that 3 times and are rated on an instrument called t-test in those different domains that you see on the lower left. And so this yielded over the 3, we got information, and not only from our field supervisors, but every student has a cooperating teacher that is in the district. And so we actually got some really good data on both quantitatively and qualitatively on things that we needed to do in our training of our cooperating teachers. We found they tended to rate the students much more highly. And so we knew we needed to amp up that training so that they felt more comfortable giving them, instead of rating them proficient from day one. So that became very helpful. And then qualitatively, the thing that we're trying with our clinical practices to improve is our observations and feedback systems to the students so that they can be day 1 ready. No longer should a child, it is not okay for any child to have a novice teacher that can't manage the classroom. They need to be day 1 ready. Particularly in schools where you have marginalized students. So, so this really helped us to determine where we needed to go. Good example, this is one from Dr. Cho, where she took all the feedback that we got and turned it into a word cloud, which, is just an easy way to visually help somebody understand what the main comments were. And then stories, I'm looking at the time. Yeah, we got a couple of minutes. Well, actually, I'm going to move on, but then stories, I will show this really quickly, but we won't watch the whole thing. It's 3 minutes long. But stories are always great. And our US Prep folks helped to put this in place.
In a 2nd grade class, and we have a little boy in there, and on the very first day of school, I instantly labeled him as bad. He would throw temper tantrums, just give you this mean look, did not do what the teacher said, and I instantly was like, that's a bad kid, he has no home training, just all these negative things. And so I was like, I'm not going to pay any attention to that kid. Throughout the school year, I started talking to this kid more, especially at dismissal, because he was one of the last students to be picked up. And I would sit there and I would talk to him, and we would just joke around and have a good time. And I eventually became his friend, and I realized how to connect with him. So anytime that he would have a mean look or anything like that, I would just look at him and laugh, or poke him on the shoulder, and he would just start busting out laughing. Once you started giving him attention and becoming his friend and talking to him and having meaningful conversation, his behavior completely changed. At least towards me it did. And I just think this is such a sweet story because, like I said, I labeled him as bad, misbehaved, no home training, just overall not a good student.
So it goes into it, but then you can see how the stories are, and this is directly related to the work that Melba did in 331 in her class, and then also as a field site supervisor for this student. So powerful stuff to tell the story and about it. Let me go towards the, protect your eyes for a moment. Okay, so improvement science. So I've talked about improvement science as a methodology and practice, but let's talk about it as in a dissertation and research. How does that work? That was something that I know Dr. Cooper and I struggled with, and still are trying to make it to understand. But as I said, we became a member of CPED last year, or this year actually. And so the CPED framework, it's all based on all these same things that we've talked about. So it's, there's the advocacy component, with their principles, their guiding principles for program design. You can see a lot of the things that we've already talked about, the stakeholders. And so talks about how to create program design concepts based on those principles. So this was happening. And then we attended the CPED conference in the fall, which talked about implementing improvement sign process into your program over the entire time of the journey the students go through. And so, okay, all right. So we got, started to look at it more closely. So then it was, so what does this look like for a dissertation? One of the things that we all felt very strongly is that, about the 5-chapter dissertation. I'm going to stop share for a second and pull one up to show you. So again, this is an award-winning dissertation through CPED. Make it a little smaller so you can see it. Okay, so you can see from the table of contents, it is a 5-chapter dissertation. Chapter 2 is the lit review. You have the problem in chapter 1. This is all very familiar. And the lit review is a little different than I would expect and probably would want. And then in chapter 3, you have the methodology. She uses a mixed methodology. So she does use quantitative and qualitative in her approach. Chapter 4, the findings, and then chapter 5, the conclusions. So a lot of the pieces, the same pieces are there, just how she does it. As you can see from, I'm just looking at the fishbone, you're doing the same improvement science process where, looking for root causes is a big part of it. Again, for that prediction. And I would be happy. I wonder if I can, do you know if I can submit documents on your chat?
You should be able to, yeah. Don't want to overpromise what Zoom can deliver, but you should be able to.
I'm going to give it a go.
Yeah, let's move dangerously.
Yeah, I would love to share. It's not going to let me, but I would be happy to share it with you. And then lastly, let me open my document again. Do you see my PowerPoint? I don't think you see my PowerPoint. Now you should see. So with all that, that leads us to where we are. So yes, we're in the process of using improvement science as a methodology in the doctoral program and figuring out how we as a program want to have that look. So as stated, I've introduced you to improvement in science on a high level and talked about how it got to be where improvement science was considered much needed in the arsenal of tools. Still doing traditional research. We will always do traditional research, but also this is another methodology that we will use. And explain how and why we were moving towards this as a research method. Okay.
All righty. Thank you, Lawrence. I know we're right up against 1 o'clock, so if folks need to dive out, I mean, I can't stop you even if I don't want you to go. But if you do have questions, I'm sure Sarah would be more than happy to stick around. Although again, I can't require it. So yeah, that's a good point. Thanks, Trish. Let's go ahead and say thank you first to Dr. Lawrence. I forget where virtual is supposed to be the same. So you can applaud like I will, like in reality, or you can put your little fake ones up. That's fine too. Not that I'm looking down on you for doing fake Zoom applause. Anyway, all right. Any questions for Dr. Lawrence?
I was just surprised that went so fast. I hope it wasn't incredibly boring because I'm actually shocked it took this long.
I think it was good. All right, yeah. So if you have a question, I'd say just go ahead and unmute and ask it.
I have a comment.
Sure.
Yes.
That was extremely helpful because I'm still trying to wrap my mind around how US Prep, Raise Your Hand Texas, and all these things fit together. So that visual was helpful.
Hopefully that wasn't the first time you saw that. Surely I've showed that to you before.
I don't recall.
You can be honest.
If you
call
did, I've
people
forgotten.
Okay, yeah. Any other questions or comments that folks want to make?
Well, thank you, Dr. Layton. I see you're in defense of external validity.
Okay, well, if you do end up having any questions that occur to you later on, I'd say go ahead and I'm sure you can reach out to Dr. Lawrence, right? By email or wander down the hall if you're on campus and go see her. I'm assuming you're on campus somewhere, but I don't know. There we go. All right, well, thank you very much, folks. And our next honors colloquium is in a couple of weeks. I will send out a notification about that. I believe it is Dr. Aaron Marvel. So I think he's next. I'll have to look at my schedule, but I will see you all then. See you. Thanks again, Lawrence.
Thank you.